I would hand over now to Ursula Schale to the next, that will present the next session to you and the great panelists we have in store for you.
Thank you, Valerie. I'm very excited to be here and having been asked to chair this first session that includes 4 speakers. The people in these sessions today have been colleagues of mine and mentors, so it's really exciting to be part of it. We will have the 4 talks first, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the 4 talks, where we have about 30 minutes. So if you have questions, please post them either in the Q&A or in the chat. And if you have a question for a specific person, then just please state so in your question, because then we can direct it more. Otherwise, the question will be asked to all the panelists of the first session. So I'll introduce the first speaker, Brian Fath. He already introduced himself at the beginning, but he is a professor at Towson University in Baltimore and a senior research scholar at IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis near Vienna in Austria. He is an expert on systems ecology, urban metabolism, and sustainability. And today we'll hear from Professor Fath on ecological principles and network mutualisms. And the floor is yours. So I should probably rather say the screen is yours, since we don't have floors these days. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, thank you, Ursula. Ike, you had it wrong. That was a very hard act to follow, so you put me in the difficult position. The beautiful figures, as always, the hand-drawn figures, I love those, so I'll have to ask you to get some of those. I also agree completely with the need to transform science itself, a whole nother passion of mine. But today I'm going to talk about one of the other things you touched on, which is the non-dualist and relational aspects of complex adaptive systems, and in particular in the context of network mutualism. And make sure I can move ahead. One quick advertisement before I jump into it is that one of the things that IASA does every year is holding a Young Scientist Summer Program, which is for PhD students to come to IASA for the summer for 3 months and work with the IASA scientists on research projects. And so obviously for 2021, it's settled, but the application deadline is always going to be kind of mid-January. So you can look for that at the IASA website. And we're hoping that 2022 will be in person. 2020 was virtual and 2021 is also virtual, but should still be a great summer for us. A little history. There was the first edition of New Ecology System Perspective was spearheaded by our colleague Sven Jorgensen, and he hosted a workshop for about a week. He invited us all to the island of Mern in Denmark, and that's a photo there on the cover of the book from Mern. And the book then came out a few years later in 2007. In the interim, he was also spearheading an effort to do some other work in terms of limits to growth, but looking at nature and how that helps to understand how we can actually flourish within limits to growth. And he had already worked out an effort to have a second edition of the New Ecology book. But then unfortunately he passed in March of 2016. But we were able to use that momentum and to keep going. And we actually met, I believe it was January of 2017 at IASA for another brainstorming session. So we decided to put IASA on the cover of the new edition. And yes, and so we're fortunate that we had lost 2 of the authors of those books, Sven and Enzo, but the rest of the authors are actually all speakers here today. So we were able to pull that together. One of the things that came out of that book was, during our brainstorming, was this idea of really trying to synthesize what is it that ecosystems do. And I understand there's all sorts of problems with lists, and you know, you always exclude something or maybe to have redundancies and so on. But after several decades of really thinking about this, we came up with what we think are 9 principles that define pretty well what ecosystems are doing. And so that's the foundation for all of this. And the first ones are the material constraints, which are the real fundamental, you know, first and second laws of thermodynamics and the periodic table. Basically, you have to obey those things. Those are the material constraints. Nature does, and does a good job with that. The next 2 are the ontological properties that we observe, and that's the fact that ecosystems are able to use energy to move further away from thermodynamic equilibrium, right? So they're able to complexify themselves. And we look at this as the physically driven biological aspect, because it's something biology does, but it does it strictly physically in some sense. Bob will probably correct me on that in a second. But the second part is that they not only move further from equilibrium, but they co-evolve and adapt while they're doing it, right? So they have that resilience feature already built in. So that's the biologically driven biological aspect. And those two together, I think, actually teach you a lot about understanding ecology and understanding nature. And then from there are the phenomenological properties, which are the fact that ecosystems are highly diverse. Again, the complexity issue coming in terms of different types and numbers of types. They also work together in networks, and we see networks everywhere in nature. There are also hierarchies that emerge as a natural order of those organizations. And then lastly, that there's a large amount of information at the genetic level, at the biochemical level, and even at the process level. So all of these together, we think could be the foundations for a new ecology, for an ecology textbook, and that's what we tried to do in writing that book. What I'm going to focus on today is number 7, which is the ecosystems work together in networks. That's my own kind of passion, again, I guess I would say, and how we can apply these to other kinds of systems, not just ecosystems, but socioeconomic systems. Well, networks are everywhere. We see networks in all kinds of applications. It helps you to represent the system as interacting components. You can identify and quantify direct and indirect effects in the system. And what I'm actually going to do now is to go through a little bit of the nitty-gritty of the details of how we can see some of these properties. So I'm going to get a little bit technical here for a second, but here's an example of one of these ecological network models. This is a oyster reef model. It's almost the Drosophila of ecological network analysis, because it's used so much to test the kinds of ideas that we have. It was empirically derived from work that Damon Patton had published back in 1981. And it basically shows the flows of energy, the exchanges of energy between the different compartments in the model. Maybe it's a little more easy to see the pictures of them rather than just the names. So we have oysters at the base of this food web. Well, there are no plants in this one, but that's for its own reasons I don't want to get into. We'll take what we have. There's detritus, there's predators, and then there's bottom feeders, and they're all exchanging energy according to what was observed out in that reef system. Well, one of the things that you can do immediately is to understand the connections better is to construct an adjacency matrix, which is essentially a binary representation of the ones and zeros of either is there 0 if there's no link, 1 if there is a link. This particular network has 12 internal flows, so there are 12 non-zero elements, and each one of those is in the place that represents the flow from one compartment to another. When you have an adjacency matrix, then you can take powers of that adjacency matrix, and that actually tells you the number of pathways that is commensurate with the power of that matrix. So it's one of these very useful properties of networks and matrix multiplication that you see here. If you have a two-step, A squared, it tells you all the two-step pathways, the number of paths between any two nodes that take 2 steps, or that take 3 steps, or 4 steps, or 5 steps, and so on. And you see that the numbers are rising much faster than the power, such that if you even get to something like 10 steps, you have now hundreds of different pathways of flow. And if you get up to 20 steps, you now have in some cases millions of different pathways, unique pathways of flow between any two nodes. So immediately that just kind of blows your mind, because it's saying there's so much going on there in the structure of that network that we just wouldn't see otherwise, right? That this is kind of revealing all those possible pathways for energy and influence to travel in that network. Well, that's fine, and that does tell you something about it, but it's also useful to know something about the actual flows in the network, because in this particular case, we know not only that there's a connection between any two compartments, but we know the amount of energy that's flowing between them. So we have something called a flow analysis, which allows us to quantify what the flow is between any two compartments of any length of that of pathways. So what I've drawn here is the representation of that 6-compartment system, but only with the first order paths. So the filter feeders, these oysters here, are giving flow to the predators, and they're giving flow to the detritus. That's it. That's their only direct connection, right? They have no direct connection with the other 3 compartments. And in fact, what this number represents is essentially the fraction of flow, or the probability of flow, that flow going through this oyster reef compartment is going to make it to this compartment. So about 38% goes there, only about 1% goes to the predators. The rest is lost from the system as heat loss or as metabolic waste or even just downstream waste. But then if you look at the second order pathways, you see more of the compartments emerge. In fact, now compartment 6 disappears. There's no way to get to the predators in 2 steps. There was in 1, and there will be in higher ones, but not in 2 steps. But this is representing the flow that goes from the filter feeders to the other compartments in 2 steps, to the other compartments in 3 steps, other compartments in 4 steps, and you can continue to play this game, of course, indefinitely. But there's another nice trick in the network analysis toolbox, which is that you can actually sum up this infinite series. As you were to continue to take out those powers, they will eventually go to 0, so that you can add up all the terms. And there's a nice shorthand in order to do that, which we get then something called an integral matrix, which is the sum of all the powers of that first flow matrix that we had. And this particular representation is now showing you what that integral flows are. Now, these are no longer probabilities because this is a sum of all the flows along all possible lengths. So it's telling you the impact that the first compartment has on every other compartment across all the lengths of the indirect flows. And then one of the things that is another interesting thing to take then is to look at, well, what was the relation of those indirect pathways, the ones 2 and greater, versus the direct pathways? Because we know the direct pathways, that's what our data set gave us, that's what we're measuring. It turns out in that particular example was that the total flow, this is non-dimensionalized, so these are just the sum of those past matrices I showed you, was 8.3, whereas the direct flow was only about 3.3. So 5 units of the total flow came from indirect flows. So more of the flow is coming from the indirect pathways than the direct pathways. So as a field ecologist and you're making observations, you need to do that in order to get your data sets, but then recognize that there's all those other things that you're not seeing that are part of the actual contribution to the functioning of that system. So when the indirect effects are greater than the direct, this leads to one of the key results of this entire theory, which we refer to as either dominance of indirectness, or I believe in the book we use network non-locality as a way to describe that the network allows you to see the importance of the non-local or non-adjacent parts of that system. So again, we have unexpected behavior that's emerging from these system interactions. Well, we can do with the network, it's always bidirectional with our flows. And so although flow is going out from one compartment to another, it's always coming into the compartment. And so you get a completely different perspective if you now do an input analysis, where you're saying, what is the flow that is coming into each compartment, right? So from the predator's point of view, they're getting almost 70% of all their flow from the oysters, even though it was only 1% of the flow out of the oysters to the predators. So we're now taking it not where my flow is going, but where is my flow coming from, right? So this is this bidirectional analysis that we can do. And the detritus was getting about 75% of its flow in the direct direct step from the oysters. Again, you can do the power series to see the indirect flows. So you can take g squared for 2 steps and g cubed for 3 steps and 4 steps, and again, the indirect pathways continue, but again, they are dissipating down to 0 over the long term. So you can sum up this infinite series and get the integral influence that each one has. And now something interesting comes from the input analysis here, was that each compartment actually has a value exactly equal to 1. What that says is that, and it's a product of this particular network, because there's only flow into the oysters as the source of energy for the system. So indirectly, every compartment is entirely dependent on the oysters for their energy, which makes sense. So without the oysters, they're all going to perish. They don't have any flow sustaining them. So in this particular case, all flow is dependent on one supplying source. If you had a different network, you'd see different numbers, but you can still then tease apart where that is coming from. All right, so when Ika mentioned about relational aspects of that, so what I've been looking at so far and showing you is what you get from the flows, from the material transactions that goes on there. But there's also relations that exist between all of those different nodes in that system, and we can think of relations as the power, the sign combination of the interaction. So you can either have mutualisms plus plus, predations plus minus, competition minus minus, and so on. It's this two, the two signs paired together. And there's a way, again, using the network toolbox in order to get at this more technically. I won't go through the numbers technically for this part of it, but just to give you an example, that if you were to look at a simple food chain with only 2 compartments and had corn and mice, so the mice are eating the corn, and you'd say, well, that's clearly predation. The mice are gaining energy, the corn are being consumed by the mice. If you had another food chain and you said, well, the mice are being eaten by the cats, and so that's also predation. You've got the mice are disappearing and the cats are getting fat. And if that was the boundary conditions of your study, you would think that there's 2 predation relations, and it's pretty cruel world out there. But all you had to do was link them together in a slightly more complex model with 3 compartments and put the corn, mice, and cats all together. And you see that even though, so this is your sign relations here, the plus minus shows the mice are eating the corn, and the plus minus here shows the cats are eating the mice, but the 0, 0 across the diagonal shows you that you've got the corn and the cats are not directly touching each other. However, what you see is that in indirect sense, when you run this power series out to include all the indirect pathways, that in fact the corn and the cats are indirect mutualists. So you're getting a behavior that you wouldn't have seen if you have too simplified of a model and if you don't look at the indirect interactions there. And this particular example is easy enough to walk through because it's showing you the the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I see that my time is up. I was going to show you. Give me just 2 more minutes. That the system that actually has the most mutualism is in fact an infinite cycle. All the compartments are actually mutualistic with each other, except for the one that they're passing their flow onto. So when we talk about circular economy and we talk about adding more symbiosis and circularity, that's the benefits that we can see coming from this as well too. I'll skip this example because time is out. It was just back to the oyster reef again. I wanted to give you one quick hit of how this applies to social economic examples and some of the papers that we published recently using network analysis to look at global crude oil trade, urban metabolism, and US grain trade. Now the nodes are represented in these nice circle diagrams. And then with some studies we've been doing with urban metabolism and looking at carbon emissions in Beijing over a series of years. And again, we can now stack up what the different indirect flows are from the different sectors that are exchanging flows, and seeing that manufacturing and transport and electricity display are the large ones. So we had a series of years there for Beijing and how it changed, particularly with the Olympics coming. This is all work that will be published soon, hopefully. And then, so just to give some conclusions, was that all the compartments we see are connected through these indirect interactions. The indirect flows can be greater than the direct flows. The system level relations can be different from the direct observed relations. So those mutualisms can emerge from neutralisms or even from predations. And usually what we've found is that mutualism is the most dominant relationship type in the ecosystems that we've looked at. So it's a different perspective than the red in tooth and claw that we have come to believe, but the systems approach shows you that there's a lot of indirect mutualism, particularly if there's more cycling. Okay, sorry for being a few minutes over. I hope Ursula remembers that picture there. So, okay, I will hand it back over. Apologies for being a minute over.
Thank you very much. Good to see something from the continent. So thanks for illustrating to us how complex the systems really are, something that Ika has already alluded to. And when we really paint them out, we see how many different connections are involved.